So I thought we could begin by discussing this word neuroethics, which is receiving a lot of attention lately, is a really burgeoning field. And I'm thinking, Judy, perhaps you can explain a bit to us about what neuroethics is, what it tells us, and so forth.
When we think about neuroethics, we're really thinking about the intersection of neuroscience and biomedical ethics. So we're thinking about research and translation and even the commercialization of discoveries in science as they apply to the nervous system, our brain, our spinal cord, and why it's a special topic. So we think about the genome. We can all sequence our genome now, potentially, but we also think about the brainome. What makes us special in terms of who we are as individuals, as humans, each with our own values and our cultures and the priorities that are really important to us. And in the neuroethics space, we think about these challenges really all across the lifespan, from children all the way through our aging population. So if I think about seniors in Canada and seniors all over the world, at least in our industrialized countries, I think about new technology that has become so powerful and is touching each of us deeply. So for example, we have new capabilities for doing brain scans and probing into what might underlie disease processes when somebody's starting to show symptoms, and potentially even what might predict disease processes before somebody's starting to show symptoms. How do we deal with that information? Do we share it? Do we disclose it? How do we deal with it? I think about new technologies now like deep brain stimulation, for example, highly invasive, but with huge potential possibly to alleviate disorders like depression that are unresponsive to drug therapy, maybe even somewhere in the future to disorders like Alzheimer's disease. The technology, the potential capabilities, and the volume of data are huge. One of the things in our ethics space that we're also very concerned about is how the commercial world, the for-profit world, is actually bringing to light these technologies to our population. What does the marketing look like? What does the consumer industry look like? And how are we ensuring, and how can we work together in partnership to ensure that the information that's getting out to people is accurate, scientifically valid, fully transparent in terms of potential conflicts of interest, and really maximizing the potential for people to benefit from what might be available to them either directly or through their healthcare providers. One of the most exciting domains of work in our area in neuroethics at UBC is being conducted by Dr. Julie Robillard, and she's been looking at communication in social media.
So what we're looking at essentially is that older adults, as well as teenagers and other demographics, are increasingly spending time online, and they're increasingly going online to look for health information and to find resources. And we know that even about a third of adults who use the internet will go online specifically to assess whether they or a loved one has a disorder that they're concerned about. So there's very little information about what it is that people do when they go online and what sorts of information they find. And yes, this can have a huge impact on what happens to them health-wise after they gather the information and all sorts of activities that they may conduct online. So some of my work has looked at what people are sharing online, what types of sources of information are valued. And one of the ways we looked at that is by mining the platform Twitter, which is a hugely popular platform. And right off the bat, I can hear the doubts, right? Twitter's for teenagers, but that's not the case. And increasingly, there's discussions around aging. And in fact, in 24 hours, we found over 9,000 tweets that had to do with dementia or with Alzheimer's disease. That's a huge amount of information. And we know also that caregivers of people with dementia may go online to consult these resources. So then what we did is we took the sample and we dug a little further to see what it is that people were talking about. And there's a common misconception that people go on Twitter to share mundane tidbits of everyday life. And surprisingly, we actually did not find that at all. What we found is that people went online and they shared information from news sources, from health information sites. That does not, however, mean that the information is correct, obviously. And we found that some of the more interesting topics, some of the topics that featured more prominently in our sample had to do with prediction of dementia and with risk management for Alzheimer's disease. And there's quite a bit of misinterpretation. People would take studies, for example, in looking at curcumin in a fly model of Alzheimer's disease, and they would extrapolate that to mean that we should eat more curcuma, more curry, to ward off Alzheimer's disease. And there's some issues with what happens to that information once it goes online and once it takes on a life of its own through platforms such as Twitter.
Yeah, and I mean, that's obviously a great concern I hear generally about the internet, is that basically it's like a large encyclopedia, but one without any quality control. So have you looked into, I mean, what can people do about that? Particularly we're talking about older adults who we don't think actually access this technology. They are, but since there is so much misinformation about health, have you looked into, I mean, what can people do about that?
Well, you're bringing up a really good point, and in addition to Twitter, there's a lot of other types of information that people can find and people can engage with, and when we're talking about dementia and Alzheimer's disease in particular, one of those types of information is websites that have tests for Alzheimer's disease. So if you go to Google and you punch in, free test for Alzheimer's disease, you'll find loads of hits. And those tests will contain misinformation, but they'll also contain other unethical ways of displaying information. For example, some websites may have conflicts of interest. So they'll give you a test, but if you fail the test, then they'll sell you supplements. And so the first thing that people do when faced with all this information they can find online, whether on social media or whether on websites that offer tests or products, is to be aware that, as you said, there is no regulation. So what they're looking at is information that has not been vetted, that has not been quality controlled by any group of experts or physicians or anything like that. So we always recommend that the first place to go, if you want to go online, that's fine. There's a lot of really good information there, but ask your doctor for where to go first. And go to your government organizations, the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, so on. They'll have links, resources online that you can consult, and those have been vetted by these organizations, and so we know they contain minimal misinformation.
So I agree, Alzheimer's Association, Tapestry are tremendous sources and resources for older people and those who support them. One of the things we have to be thinking about is about regulation. Do we want to start going down the path of regulating what's available online in a very prescriptive way, or can we potentially do better than that by bringing together our professional societies and those of us within the industry, even from a multidisciplinary industry, scientists, physicians, geriatricians, other kinds of healthcare providers, and start developing standards from within the professions that we can put out. And we know historically that those kinds of professional guidance can enjoy much better receptivity by outside professionals and also by the community. And we always think about bringing the voices of the stakeholder to the table. So bringing people who have vested interest in aging. Well, I suppose we all have vested interest in aging after all, but those who might be touched by diseases of the nervous system like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, and bringing their voices to the table, telling us what could they benefit from in terms of online resources, guidance about how to make good decisions about the information that's on the internet, making good decisions about what seems to be a legitimate service or product that's being advertised widely, either in the newspaper, on online news media, and so forth.
Sounds like a fabulous idea, and I think engaging the stakeholders is a very important priority when we're looking at communication of science and communication of health, and so definitely getting at that information. And one of the ways we can get at that information is to look at the popularity of these sites and to say, people are craving these types of information and the ease of access in their homes to just be able to go online. And so it's definitely key to include these people in the conversation moving forward.
Right, and it's likely we're going to see more and more of that as the population
Absolutely.
becomes more technically literate. Now, I don't know, Judy, if you wanted to talk anything more about biotechnology, about promise and also perils of use of biotechnology?
That it's when we think about biotechnology, so maybe we can narrow it down to biotechnology for the brain.
Yes.
We have to think about what's the range of technology that we're thinking about. We're thinking about everything from technology for genetic testing, technology for identifying early markers of disease in the structure of the brain. We're thinking about identifying changes in function in brain function that might mark or predict or signify where somebody is along a disease process. When we think about ethical principles around those questions, we always think of four. Traditionally, we think of beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, doing no harm, justice, ensuring fairness for all, and we also think about individual autonomy, the ability and the right to make decisions and have a choice in our healthcare decisions. In neuroethics, we always layer two additional variables onto those principles, and they are context and culture. We really have come to learn through our research, our work with the communities, that the context in which we ask these questions is really important. We are dynamic people, we are dynamic communities, we're dynamic societies. We can't just ask the question in a static way. And we also think very much about culture, because we know that our Western values don't really apply to everyone. We often, here in Vancouver, think perhaps along Western principles of autonomy-based decision-making, but we know among our Aboriginal Canadian partners and communities, the community is essential in decision-making around potentially healthcare decisions, ownership of data. So we have to take everyone's culture. We have a huge indigenous population here, immigrant population here. We have to come together with the multiple voices that we can benefit from in these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's really crucial, is that cultural aspect, right? Because although ethicists, James Childress and Tom Beecham, who first publicized these four principles, emphasize that no principle trumps the other necessarily. It is true that in our culture the tendency has been to take autonomy as kind of trumping the other values, the other principles, when they come into conflict. But indeed, it's obviously true that is itself a culturally laden idea.
Absolutely, right.
Right.
We should certainly start thinking about community autonomy as important potentially for many cultures, maybe even our own ultimately, as we start to evolve the fabric of society with our technologies in ways that we can't even imagine right now.